"Sign these before dessert, Daniel," Arthur Hayes said calmly as he slid the divorce papers across the Thanksgiving table. The sentence hung in the warm dining room like a sudden winter draft, cutting through the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon apples. Eleanor Hayes watched the white envelope glide across the polished oak table toward her son, and for a moment she thought she must have misunderstood what she heard. Thanksgiving at the Hayes house had always followed the same comfortable rhythm for nearly 40 years. The football game murmuring on the television in the den, the heavy platter of turkey set at the center of the table, the familiar laughter of relatives who had gathered every November since Daniel was a boy barely tall enough to see over the edge of the table. Tonight looked no different at first glance. The dining room glowed with soft yellow light from the chandelier, and outside the tall windows the early evening sky had turned a quiet shade of blue-gray over the quiet Ohio suburb where Eleanor and her husband had raised their family. But the moment Arthur spoke, the room changed. Daniel blinked slowly, staring at the envelope in front of him as if it had appeared out of thin air. His wife Rachel sat beside him, her hand still resting on her wine glass, the faint smile on her face freezing just slightly too long before she set the glass down. Eleanor noticed that small pause immediately. She had spent decades reading the subtle signals of the people she loved, the quiet shifts in tone and expression that most people overlooked. Across the table, Arthur folded his hands with the calm patience of a man who believed he had just completed an unavoidable task. "It's better this way," he added evenly, as though he were discussing property taxes or the weather. No one spoke for several seconds. The sound of silverware settling against china plates echoed softly in the silence. Eleanor's eyes moved from Daniel's stunned expression to Rachel's carefully composed face, and then to Arthur again. Something about the moment felt wrong, not just surprising but rehearsed, like a scene in a play where everyone except the audience already knows their lines. Then Eleanor noticed something else. Near her own place setting, partly hidden beside the basket of dinner rolls, sat another envelope she didn't remember seeing earlier. It was smaller than the one Arthur had delivered, sealed with a plain strip of tape, and written across the front in neat blue ink were the words Eleanor Hayes. Her best friend Margaret Collins had pressed it into her hands earlier that afternoon when she stopped by with a pumpkin pie, whispering quietly, "You might need this tonight." At the time Eleanor had laughed, assuming Margaret was exaggerating some small piece of neighborhood gossip. Now, watching the confusion ripple across the Thanksgiving table, Eleanor felt a strange chill settle into her chest. Daniel slowly lifted the divorce papers, his brow tightening as he scanned the first page. Rachel reached toward him as if to explain something, then stopped herself. Arthur remained perfectly still. And Eleanor realized that whatever was happening at this table had been building long before the turkey was carved, long before the family gathered, and long before anyone expected Thanksgiving dinner to become the moment when the truth finally arrived. Daniel did not speak for several seconds. He kept his eyes on the pages in his hands, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. The soft light above the table reflected on the legal letterhead, and the crisp pages made a faint rustling sound each time he shifted them. Eleanor watched the slow change in her son's expression. At first, there was confusion. Then disbelief. Then a quiet tightening of his jaw that reminded her of the way he looked when he was a boy trying to understand a problem he did not expect. Rachel finally broke the silence with a gentle laugh that sounded a little too careful. She leaned toward Daniel and said that there must have been some misunderstanding, that perhaps Arthur had brought the wrong documents or that the attorney had made a mistake. Her tone was calm, almost reassuring, but Eleanor noticed that Rachel did not once look directly at Arthur while she spoke. Arthur remained perfectly composed at the far end of the table. His posture was straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him as though the moment unfolding in front of the family had been expected all along. Eleanor knew Arthur well enough to recognize when he believed he had control of a situation. That calm certainty had helped him build his construction company from a small contracting business into one of the most respected firms in the county. It was the same confidence that once made people trust him without question. But tonight that confidence felt different. It felt calculated. Daniel finally lowered the papers and looked up at his father. His voice was quiet but steady as he asked why anyone would bring divorce papers to a Thanksgiving dinner. Arthur answered as if the explanation were obvious. He said that difficult decisions were easier when the family was gathered together and that waiting longer would only make things more complicated. Eleanor felt a slow uneasiness settle deeper in her chest as she listened. Over the past year, she had noticed small shifts in the way conversations happened inside the Hayes family. Rachel had gradually taken over many of the business discussions that once belonged to Daniel. Arthur had begun holding private meetings at the company office that Eleanor only heard about afterward. At the time, she assumed it was simply part of Daniel learning to manage the family business while balancing his marriage. Now those memories returned with uncomfortable clarity. Rachel reached across the table and placed a hand lightly on Daniel's arm, telling him that perhaps they should talk about everything later in private. Daniel did not move his arm away, but he did not look reassured either. The rest of the family sat quietly around the table, uncertain whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of something far more serious. Eleanor's attention drifted slowly to the smaller envelope beside her plate. The neat handwriting on the front seemed almost out of place among the plates and serving dishes. Margaret Collins had been Eleanor's closest friend since their early 20s, back when both women were newly married and raising young families on the same quiet street. Margaret was not someone who enjoyed drama, and she certainly was not someone who delivered mysterious envelopes without reason. Eleanor remembered the brief moment earlier that afternoon when Margaret handed it to her at the front door. Margaret's voice had been soft, but unusually serious when she said that Eleanor should open it if things became confusing tonight. At the time, Eleanor assumed Margaret was referring to some harmless family surprise. Now she was no longer certain. Daniel turned another page of the documents and asked a few careful questions about the legal details written across the top of the first page. Arthur answered calmly, explaining that the paperwork had been prepared by a reputable attorney and that it simply needed Daniel's signature to begin the process. Rachel nodded slowly as if the explanation confirmed something she already expected. Eleanor felt the quiet rhythm of the evening shifting further away from the comfortable tradition Thanksgiving once held in their home. The turkey on the platter had already cooled slightly, and the steam rising from the mashed potatoes had faded into the warm air. Yet no one reached for the serving spoon. Every eye seemed to move between Daniel and the papers in his hands. Eleanor slowly rested her fingers on the small envelope beside her plate. The paper felt firm beneath her fingertips. And for the first time that evening, she began to wonder whether Margaret already knew something the rest of the family had not yet discovered. Daniel continued staring at the legal pages in his hands, but the longer he read, the more the confusion on his face slowly shifted into something heavier. The room felt unusually quiet for a house that normally echoed with conversation during the holiday meal. Even the faint sounds of traffic outside the neighborhood seemed distant, as if the entire evening had narrowed down to the few sheets of paper resting on the dining table. Eleanor watched her son carefully. She had raised Daniel to think before reacting, and she could see that instinct working now. His eyes moved slowly across the printed paragraphs, pausing at certain lines as though he was trying to understand how such documents could exist without his knowledge. Rachel sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. She had regained the composed expression she often wore at social gatherings, the polite smile that made neighbors describe her as gracious and elegant. Yet Eleanor noticed that Rachel's eyes never settled in one place for long. They moved quickly between Daniel, Arthur, and the envelope on the table, like someone trying to follow a conversation that had taken an unexpected turn. Arthur finally cleared his throat and spoke again in the same measured tone he used during company meetings. He explained that the documents were simply a practical step forward and that sometimes marriages reach a point where it is wiser to move on before resentment grows. His voice remained calm and professional, but Eleanor noticed that he avoided looking directly at Rachel when he spoke those words. Daniel placed the pages down on the table for a moment and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if trying to steady his thoughts. He asked his father when these papers had been prepared and why he had never heard anything about them until tonight. Arthur replied that the arrangements had been handled quietly over the past few weeks by a trusted attorney who specialized in family business matters. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as though every detail had been planned well before the first guest arrived for dinner. Rachel reached for her wine glass again and took a small sip, then set it down with a careful motion that seemed intended to appear relaxed. She told Daniel that perhaps the attorney simply believed it was time to have an honest conversation about the future. Her words were gentle, but Eleanor could hear a subtle tension behind them, like a note played slightly off-key in a familiar melody. Around the table, the other relatives remained silent, unsure whether to speak or pretend nothing unusual was happening. The traditional Thanksgiving dinner had paused in an uncomfortable stillness. The carved turkey rested untouched on its platter, the golden skin now cooling under the dining room lights. The bowls of vegetables and stuffing sat where Eleanor had carefully arranged them earlier that afternoon, when she still believed the evening would follow the comforting traditions her family had shared for decades. Eleanor slowly withdrew her hand from the small envelope beside her plate and rested it in her lap. She studied the faces around the table again. Daniel looked thoughtful but unsettled. Rachel looked composed but alert. Arthur looked confident in the quiet way of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The entire scene carried an uneasy sense of structure, like a conversation guided by invisible lines that only a few people in the room seemed to understand. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment pressing against her patience. Margaret Collins was not the type of person who left warnings without reason. If Margaret had believed Eleanor might need that envelope tonight, then something larger than a simple misunderstanding must already be unfolding. Daniel picked up the papers once more and read the final page, his brow tightening as he reached the section where his signature would be required. He did not sign anything. Instead, he looked across the table again, this time studying Rachel with a quiet seriousness that Eleanor had not seen in his eyes for a long time. Arthur waited calmly, as though expecting the next step to be simple. But Eleanor sensed the evening was moving in a direction none of them had fully predicted yet. And the unopened envelope resting beside her plate suddenly felt less like a coincidence and more like the missing piece of a story that was only beginning to reveal itself. Daniel placed the papers down again, but this time he did not look at his father immediately. Instead, he stared at the polished surface of the oak table, as if searching for something in the reflection of the overhead light. Eleanor could see the careful rhythm of his breathing as he tried to process the moment without reacting too quickly. That habit had always defined him. Even as a child, he had been the kind of boy who listened longer than he spoke. Rachel finally shifted in her chair and spoke again, her voice soft and patient, as if she were trying to guide the conversation back toward something ordinary. She told Daniel that sometimes families avoided difficult conversations for too long, and that perhaps his father was simply trying to help everyone face reality. The words sounded thoughtful, but Eleanor noticed something subtle in Rachel's tone. There was no surprise in it. No real confusion. It sounded more like someone explaining a decision that had already been discussed many times before. Daniel slowly raised his eyes toward Arthur. He asked one simple question. He asked whether Rachel had known about these documents before tonight. The question landed on the table with the same quiet weight as the envelope earlier in the evening. Rachel's smile faded for a fraction of a second before returning. She said that Arthur had mentioned the possibility of legal discussions weeks ago, and that they had talked briefly about how complicated marriage could become when business responsibilities were involved. Arthur nodded calmly as if confirming a detail from a routine meeting. Eleanor felt a slow realization beginning to take shape in her mind. Over the past year, she had watched small changes move through the Hayes family like quiet shadows. Rachel had gradually become more involved in the company accounts. She had started attending meetings with Daniel and Arthur even when those meetings had once been private. At first, Eleanor believed Rachel was simply supporting her husband's growing responsibilities. But now those memories carried a different meaning. Daniel leaned back again and rubbed his forehead slowly as if trying to recall conversations that suddenly seemed incomplete. He asked Arthur why the paperwork suggested a legal separation that involved business ownership as well as marriage. Arthur responded that it was simply a precaution to protect the company during a personal transition. His explanation sounded polished, but it did not answer the question Daniel had actually asked. Around the table, the rest of the family remained quiet. The air in the room felt warmer than before, yet no one reached for the food. The dinner that Eleanor had spent hours preparing now felt like a background detail to a conversation no one had expected to have tonight. Eleanor glanced again at the envelope beside her plate. The neat handwriting of Margaret Collins looked calm and certain, as if the person who wrote it already understood how the evening would unfold. Eleanor remembered the exact moment Margaret handed it to her earlier that afternoon. Margaret had stood on the front porch holding the pumpkin pie with both hands and looking more serious than usual. She had said that Eleanor should keep the envelope nearby and open it only if something strange happened during dinner. At the time, Eleanor thought her friend was being overly cautious about some small neighborhood rumor. Now the memory felt entirely different. Daniel looked from Rachel to Arthur once more. His voice remained steady but carried a new edge of caution. He said that if decisions about his marriage and the company had been discussed for weeks, then he should have been part of those conversations. Rachel answered quickly that everything had been done for his benefit and that sometimes people who cared about him simply wanted to make difficult things easier. Arthur nodded again with the quiet confidence of someone who believed his reasoning would eventually be accepted. But Eleanor could see the tension building behind Daniel's calm expression. The pieces of the situation were slowly rearranging in his mind. And Eleanor realized that the envelope Margaret left beside her plate might contain the one piece of information that would explain why this Thanksgiving dinner had suddenly turned into something far more complicated than anyone at the table had expected. For several seconds, no one moved. The silence around the dining table felt heavier than before, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Daniel slowly gathered the papers together and placed them neatly back on the table, but he did not push them away, and he did not sign them. His eyes moved again between Arthur and Rachel, searching their expressions with the careful attention of someone realizing that the situation in front of him might be far more complicated than it first appeared. Eleanor watched the moment unfold with a quiet sense of clarity forming in her mind. For most of the evening, she had remained still, listening, observing, allowing the others to speak. But the longer the conversation continued, the more she remembered Margaret's warning from earlier that afternoon. Margaret had not looked curious or amused when she delivered that envelope. She had looked concerned. Eleanor slowly lifted the envelope from the table. The movement was small, but it drew the attention of everyone seated nearby. Rachel noticed first. Her eyes flicked toward the envelope and then back toward Eleanor with a polite expression that seemed carefully controlled. Arthur followed the movement a moment later, his calm posture remaining unchanged, but his gaze sharpening slightly as he watched Eleanor's hands. Daniel noticed the envelope last. His brow furrowed slightly as he asked his mother what she was holding. Eleanor answered honestly that it was something Margaret Collins had given her earlier that day and that Margaret told her she might need to read it tonight. Rachel attempted a gentle laugh and said that Margaret had always enjoyed drama more than most people. The comment sounded light-hearted, but Eleanor could hear the tightness beneath it. Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned the envelope over in her hands and examined the simple strip of tape that sealed it shut. The paper inside felt thicker than a single letter. It felt like several pages stacked together. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair, his curiosity growing as he watched his mother. Arthur remained quiet at the end of the table, but Eleanor noticed that his attention had shifted away from the divorce papers and toward the envelope. Eleanor carefully opened the tape and slid the contents out onto the table. Several printed pages appeared along with 2 photographs and a set of neatly organized financial statements. The first page contained a series of business transfer records connected to Hayes Construction, the company Arthur had built and Daniel now helped manage. Eleanor read the numbers slowly, recognizing account details she had seen years earlier when she helped Arthur review company taxes. The documents showed funds moving between corporate accounts and a smaller private investment account that carried a name Eleanor did not recognize. Daniel leaned closer and asked quietly where the papers came from. Eleanor answered that Margaret had said they were copies of publicly filed records that had recently appeared during a routine property transaction in town. The second page contained a list of signatures connected to those transactions. One of the signatures belonged to Arthur Hayes. Another belonged to Rachel Hayes. Daniel stared at the page in silence. Rachel's composed expression began to shift slightly as she reached for the papers. She explained quickly that business accounts often moved money during development projects, and that the records likely represented a simple accounting arrangement that Daniel had not yet been informed about. Arthur nodded once again, confirming her explanation in the same calm voice he had used all evening. But Eleanor continued reading. The final document described a proposed restructuring of ownership shares within the company, scheduled to take effect after certain legal conditions were completed. Those conditions included the formal separation of Daniel Hayes from Rachel Hayes, followed by a transfer of voting shares that would temporarily move management authority away from Daniel's control. The quiet confidence that had surrounded Arthur earlier in the evening began to fade from the room. Daniel slowly placed both hands on the table as he read the page himself. Eleanor watched the realization reach him piece by piece. And for the first time that night, it became clear that the Thanksgiving dinner everyone expected had quietly turned into the moment when a carefully planned arrangement had finally been brought into the open. Daniel read the final document twice before he spoke again. The quiet determination in his face had replaced the confusion from earlier in the evening. He slowly pushed the divorce papers aside and focused entirely on the financial statements that Eleanor had placed on the table. The numbers were clear, organized in the careful language of corporate filings. They described money moving through accounts connected to Hayes Construction and into a newly formed holding company registered only 3 months earlier. Daniel recognized the structure immediately because he had studied the same type of legal framework during his business training. It was the kind of arrangement used when someone planned to shift control of a company without drawing attention. Daniel looked up first at Rachel and then at Arthur. His voice remained calm, but there was no uncertainty left in it when he asked why a private holding company had been created without his knowledge. Rachel opened her mouth as if ready to respond, but Arthur answered first. Arthur explained that restructuring sometimes required temporary adjustments in ownership and that experienced business leaders often made those decisions quietly in order to protect long-term stability. His explanation sounded practiced, the tone steady and confident as if he had delivered similar explanations in many boardrooms before. But Daniel did not appear convinced. He turned the second page toward the light and pointed to the section describing the transfer of voting shares that would occur immediately after the divorce was finalized. According to the document, Rachel would temporarily hold controlling interest through the holding company until a later review by corporate counsel. Daniel asked one simple question. He asked why his own name disappeared from the voting structure the moment the divorce papers were signed. Rachel finally spoke again, her voice still calm but now carrying a trace of urgency. She said that the arrangement was only temporary and that the attorneys believed separating personal and business matters would protect Daniel from potential legal complications. Eleanor listened carefully to every word. The explanation sounded polished, but something about it felt incomplete. Daniel read another paragraph and then quietly set the document down again. The realization that reached him was slow but unmistakable. If he signed the divorce documents tonight, the corporate restructuring would activate immediately. Ownership authority would move away from him, even though the company had always been described as a family business he would eventually lead. Eleanor watched Arthur closely. For most of the evening Arthur had appeared calm and confident, but now there was a subtle tension in the way he rested his hands on the table. Rachel leaned slightly toward Daniel again and spoke in a reassuring tone, telling him that complicated legal matters often appeared worse on paper than they actually were. She suggested that the attorneys could clarify everything the following week and that tonight did not need to become a stressful discussion. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he turned the final page of Margaret's documents toward Eleanor and asked where Margaret had found these records. Eleanor explained that Margaret had recently helped a local real estate office review several public filings connected to commercial property developments around town. During that process, she noticed the creation of the new holding company and recognized several familiar names attached to it. Margaret had become concerned when she realized the structure seemed connected to Hayes' construction. Daniel nodded slowly as he listened. He had always respected Margaret Collins because she was known for noticing details others overlooked. The quiet confidence that had filled Arthur's voice earlier in the evening now seemed less certain as Daniel gathered the documents into a neat stack. The dinner plates remained untouched around the table. The warm smell of roasted turkey had faded into the background of a conversation that had shifted far beyond a holiday meal. Daniel finally leaned forward and looked directly at his father again. This time his voice carried a calm firmness that Eleanor had not heard before. He said that before anyone discussed signing legal papers, he believed the entire family deserved a complete explanation of why these arrangements had been created without his knowledge. And for the first time since the evening began, Arthur did not answer immediately. Arthur finally spoke after the silence stretched long enough for everyone at the table to feel the weight of it. His voice remained controlled, but the easy confidence that had defined his earlier explanations had faded slightly. He said that business leadership often required difficult decisions, and that sometimes those decisions had to be made quickly in order to protect a company from uncertainty. Daniel listened without interrupting, but his expression remained steady and thoughtful. Eleanor could see that he was no longer simply reacting to what had happened tonight. He was examining every word, every detail, the way he did when evaluating a complicated construction contract. Rachel leaned forward slightly and placed both hands on the table as if she were trying to restore the calm atmosphere that had existed earlier in the evening. She said that Arthur had only been trying to prevent the company from becoming entangled in a personal dispute and that the legal structure was meant to be temporary until everything could be settled properly. The explanation sounded reasonable at first, but Daniel quietly slid one of the financial pages back across the table. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the document that described a review period lasting 18 months. He asked why a temporary solution required a year and a half before ownership would be reconsidered. Rachel paused before answering. She said that legal reviews sometimes moved slowly and that attorneys preferred to avoid rush decisions when valuable assets were involved. Daniel nodded slightly but did not appear convinced. Eleanor watched the exchange carefully. For years, she had observed business conversations between Arthur and Daniel, and she knew when her son recognized that something was missing from an explanation. Daniel turned toward Arthur again and asked another question. He asked why the holding company had been registered under Rachel's name rather than under a neutral corporate trust. Arthur responded that Rachel had been assisting with several development projects and that it was convenient for the paperwork to be filed under her temporary authority. The reasoning sounded practical, but it created an uneasy silence around the table. The relatives who had gathered for Thanksgiving now watched the conversation unfold with quiet discomfort. What had begun as a family dinner had slowly transformed into something resembling a corporate negotiation. Eleanor noticed that Rachel's calm smile had grown thinner. She reached for her glass again, though the wine inside had already grown warm. Daniel gathered Margaret's documents once more and arranged them neatly beside the divorce papers. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with the same care he used when presenting proposals at the company office. He said that if the restructuring truly existed to protect the company, then it should have been discussed openly with him from the beginning. He also said that a legal arrangement designed to remove him from the voting structure immediately after a divorce did not appear to protect him at all. Rachel began to respond, but Daniel raised a hand gently, signaling that he had not finished speaking. His voice remained calm, but the certainty behind it filled the quiet room. He explained that the documents described a sequence of events that depended entirely on him signing the divorce papers that Arthur had placed on the table. Without that signature, the restructuring could not proceed as written. Arthur listened without interruption, though his hands were now resting more firmly against the table surface. Eleanor realized that the careful plan unfolding during the evening had begun to lose its balance. Daniel looked around the table once more, meeting the eyes of each family member in turn. Then he placed his hand over the divorce documents and slid them back toward Arthur. He said that before anyone discussed signatures or legal timelines, there was one simple fact that needed to be acknowledged. He had never agreed to end his marriage, and he had never agreed to surrender control of the company he had spent years helping to build. The quiet firmness in his voice carried across the dining room more clearly than any raised argument could have. And for the first time since the dinner began, Arthur seemed to understand that the outcome he expected might no longer be certain. The quiet firmness in Daniel's voice settled across the dining room like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. For the first time since the evening began, no one at the table seemed certain about what would happen next. Arthur studied the documents in front of him for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. The posture that had once projected authority now looked more like careful calculation. Rachel's expression shifted again, the polite composure she had maintained throughout the evening beginning to show small cracks that Eleanor had not seen before. Daniel remained calm. He did not raise his voice, and he did not accuse anyone directly. Instead, he gathered the financial pages that Eleanor had placed on the table and aligned them beside the divorce documents with deliberate care. His movements were slow and thoughtful, the same way he organized project plans when something important needed to be understood clearly. Eleanor watched him with quiet pride. She had seen that focus many times during his childhood when he faced problems other children avoided. Daniel finally spoke again, explaining that the sequence of legal steps described in the restructuring documents depended on a single assumption. It depended on him signing the divorce papers tonight without examining the larger consequences. He pointed to the paragraph describing the automatic transfer of voting authority once the divorce filing began. He explained that the moment the paperwork was submitted, the holding company connected to Rachel's name would temporarily control the voting structure of Hayes Construction. Arthur listened carefully, but this time he did not interrupt. Rachel attempted to respond with another calm explanation about legal precautions and the advice of attorneys, but Daniel gently shook his head before she could finish. He said that legal precautions normally involved transparency, not secrecy. If the goal had truly been to protect the company, then the documents would have included him as a participant in the restructuring rather than removing him from it. The quiet certainty in his reasoning filled the room more strongly than any raised argument. Eleanor noticed that several relatives around the table exchanged uncertain glances. They had arrived expecting a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, but the conversation unfolding in front of them had revealed a careful arrangement that now appeared incomplete. Daniel continued calmly, explaining that he had spent years studying the operations of Hayes Construction and that the financial language in Margaret's documents was unmistakable. The restructuring plan was designed to shift operational authority away from him long enough for the company's ownership structure to change permanently. Even if control returned months later, the decisions made during that time could reshape the future of the business entirely. Rachel's voice grew quieter as she attempted to insist that the plan had never been intended to harm Daniel personally. She said that business decisions often required temporary compromises and that everyone involved believed they were protecting the company from uncertainty. Daniel listened respectfully before answering that protecting a company should never require deceiving the person who had been preparing to lead it. Arthur finally folded his hands together again, but the calm certainty that had defined his earlier presence was no longer as steady. The plan he had introduced so confidently now sat exposed across the dining table in plain language. Eleanor realized that Margaret's envelope had done more than reveal hidden documents. It had interrupted a carefully timed moment that relied on silence and quick agreement. The turkey and side dishes remained untouched in the center of the table, their warmth slowly fading while the truth settled across the room. Daniel gathered the divorce papers once more and slid them gently back toward Arthur. His voice remained composed as he explained that no legal document presented during a holiday dinner would ever replace a clear and honest conversation. He then placed Margaret's documents beside them and said that the family now had something far more important to discuss than a signature. The quiet shift in control of the conversation was unmistakable, and Eleanor could see that the carefully arranged evening Arthur had expected was no longer unfolding according to his plan. The room remained quiet after Daniel finished speaking, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt resolved. Eleanor noticed the subtle change immediately. For most of the evening, the conversation had moved in careful circles, guided by assumptions that everyone at the table was expected to accept without question. Now those assumptions had disappeared. The documents lay in the center of the table like pieces of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Arthur studied them for a long moment. The lines around his eyes had deepened slightly, and for the first time that night his calm confidence seemed replaced by something closer to reflection. Rachel sat very still beside Daniel. The composed smile she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by an expression that seemed thoughtful and cautious. Daniel remained seated with his hands resting lightly on the table. He was not angry. His voice had never risen. Yet the certainty in his words had quietly reshaped the entire evening. Eleanor could see it in the way the other relatives watched him now. What had begun as a private family matter had gradually revealed something much larger. Daniel slowly gathered the documents once more and stacked them carefully, separating the divorce papers from the financial statements that Margaret had provided. He explained calmly that he understood business decisions could become complicated when family relationships were involved. But he also explained that trust was the one thing that could never be reorganized through paperwork. If trust disappeared, no legal structure could replace it. Arthur listened without interruption. After a moment, he reached forward and adjusted the stack of papers slightly as if examining them from a different perspective. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. He admitted that the restructuring plan had been created quickly after several recent projects placed unexpected pressure on the company's financial outlook. He explained that the attorneys believed a temporary shift in leadership authority could simplify negotiations with outside investors. Rachel nodded gently as if confirming that explanation. Daniel listened carefully before responding. He said that if investors required stability, the company should present strength rather than secrecy. Removing its future leader from the voting structure without explanation would only create more uncertainty if it were discovered later. Eleanor noticed that Arthur did not argue with that point. Instead, he studied Daniel's face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that the son sitting across from him was no longer the young apprentice who once followed instructions without question. Years of experience had quietly shaped Daniel into someone capable of protecting the company in ways Arthur had not fully acknowledged before. Rachel finally spoke again, her voice calmer than it had been earlier. She said that the situation had clearly become more complicated than anyone expected, and that perhaps the attorneys had focused too heavily on legal strategy rather than family communication. Her tone no longer carried the same careful confidence from earlier in the evening. It sounded more reflective, as if she had begun to reconsider the path that led to this moment. Daniel nodded slowly. He said that complicated problems often required careful planning, but planning should never begin by removing the people most affected by the decision. Eleanor felt a quiet sense of relief settle into her chest as the conversation shifted away from confrontation and toward understanding. The tension that had filled the dining room earlier now softened into thoughtful silence. Outside the windows, the evening had grown darker, and the soft glow of porch lights from neighboring houses reflected against the glass. Eleanor glanced at the turkey and side dishes still resting in the center of the table. The meal she had prepared hours earlier remained untouched, yet the evening had delivered something far more meaningful than a traditional dinner. Arthur slowly pushed the divorce papers aside and folded his hands together again. He said that perhaps tonight had revealed more than anyone intended. He also admitted that decisions made in quiet conference rooms sometimes failed to consider the people sitting at the family table. Daniel gathered Margaret's documents once more and placed them carefully back into the envelope. He then looked toward Eleanor and thanked her for opening it when the moment required clarity. Eleanor smiled gently, knowing that Margaret's instinct had helped reveal the truth before a signature could quietly change the future of the Hayes family. The dining room slowly returned to a quieter atmosphere. Conversations began again in softer voices as relatives reached for the serving dishes that had been waiting patiently through the long discussion. The holiday dinner finally continued, though everyone at the table understood that the evening had permanently changed how certain decisions would be made from this point forward. And as Eleanor watched her family begin to speak again, she realized that the envelope Margaret had delivered earlier that afternoon had not simply interrupted a plan. It had restored something far more important than any business agreement. It had restored honesty to the table where family had always belonged.